Okay.
Good to be with you, my friends. Let me pull up Genesis here on the old PowerPoint, get things going. So, if I get there we go, last people in there. So, last week we had the death of Abraham, and we had Isaac and Rebecca have twins. We just sort of had Abraham's other family, right? That got sort of pushed to the side. And then the twins show up, right? Esau, the hairy one who loves the outdoors and is Isaac's favorite. And then we have Jacob, the heel grabber, or maybe just the heel, who cooks and is Rebecca's favorite. So we have sort of the story is set for what comes next, but not a whole lot of detail, right? Then we have Jacob tricked Esau out of his birthright. So those are the main stories, just to recap from last week. This week we jump into chapter 26, which is the one chapter and only chapter with the stories we have of Isaac.
Well,
that's it. And even then, we only get a sort of slight sidelong view of the patriarch. We don't get a whole lot on Isaac here. We just get this one sort of series of stories, and that's about it. So without further setup than that, we'll look at, there's about, I don't know if I'm going to divide it into 3 or 4 sections, but there's a couple of sections. We'll read a little bit, talk about that, and then look at the next. But pretty much today we have Isaac on the stage, more or less by himself, but not a whole lot of detail on it. 26th chapter, beginning at the first verse. Now there was a famine in the land, aside from the former famine, which there had been in the days of Abraham. So Yitzhak went to Avimelech, king of the Philistines, to Gerar. And the Lord was seen by him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Continue to dwell in the land that I tell you of. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will give you blessing. For to you and to your seed I give all these lands and will fulfill the sworn oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your seed many, like the stars of the heavens, and to your seed I will give all these lands. All the nations of the earth shall enjoy blessing through your seed. In consequence of Abraham's hearkening to my voice and keeping my charge, my commandments, my laws, and my instructions." So Yitzhak stayed in Gerar. Now, when the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "my wife," thinking otherwise the people of the place will kill me on account of Rivkah, for she is beautiful to look at. But it was when he had been there a long time that Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw. And there was Yitzhak laughing and loving with Rivkah, his wife. Avimelech had Yitzhak called and said, "But here, she must be your wife. Now how could you say she is my sister?" Yitzhak said to him, "Indeed, I said to myself, otherwise I will die on account of her." Avimelech said, "What is this that you have done to us? One of the people might well have lain with your wife, and then you would have brought guilt upon us." Avimelech commanded the entire people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife must be put to death. Yes, death." Once again, this is our third sister-wife story. I don't know what it is. He's taking a page from Abraham, I guess, maybe. Abraham said this is how we got out of it, and how we survived getting out of Egypt, or even how we surprised, literally went to Abimelech. I think it was Abimelech last time that they had to lie about with Sarah. So weird. It's such a weird story. I have to think that we're missing some sort of, I don't know, whatever this would be, 3,000-year-old tradition, joke, something about sister wives. I don't know. It's so odd. Of course, the biggest part of the story is that God shows up and blesses him. So we have the weird sister story kind of thing. Sister, it's my wife, it's my sister. I'm afraid they're going to kill me. Once again, Isaac and Abraham do not come out looking particularly strong, or as they would say in the modern world, they are not alpha males. They seem to be able to, they just want to hide instead and throw their wives to the wolves. The bigger part of the story, though, is that God shows up and blesses Isaac, right? Those first 4 verses, we have all those covenant promises are renewed. I'll make your seed many. I will give you this land. I will take care of your family. The whole chapter really then ends up being about blessings. And this comes from Brueggemann. Brueggemann sees the whole chapter is about blessings in two distinct ways. This is a quote from him. There is the theological claim of blessing from Yahweh, for the Lord, and blessing as prosperity judged by worldly standards, right? So there's this sort of theological claim. God makes this promise saying, I will keep you and I will claim you. And so there is this claim that can be made almost on God's promise, or actually completely on God's promise. And then there is the reality of being blessed, which means to have lots of sheep and cattle and animals and slaves and servants and gold and everything else, right? The worldly standards show that there is a blessing. Not here, we'll see that in the next part, but it's definitely part of this conversation. Questions, comments about this first little section that we got the sister wife, we got the renewal of the covenant, this time with Isaac for the first time, but what else do we hear or see?
It's hard to get to the blessing part because you have to think about the sister wife thing.
Yes.
And that sort of clouds it, and you keep mulling over that before you get to the blessings. And I wonder, was it very common just to take another man's wife? If you like them, you just take them.
It sure seems that way, or at least that's the implication, but I don't know.
I wonder.
And they're very proud of their wives. They're very,
Their
very
first
beautiful. Everybody
wives.
wants them. Their first wives, yes. Yes, the first wives are beautiful. Who knows about the second or third, but the first is pretty great.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for some of these meetings when they sat around and decided what was in the canon and what wasn't, and why certain things made it, and
Amen.
what they think they meant in order to justify.
Not one, not two, but three stories about it. Yeah. About my wife as my sister. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I'm still haven't gotten over them having to swear on Abraham's testicles. So that's that one is, I'm still like,
Oh, but let me tell you something about
Eddie,
that.
did you miss that one?
That was 2 weeks ago.
I know.
But I know what you
struggling
mean.
with that.
And in reading reading that book, Son of Laughter, they talked a little bit about that. And it wasn't just squeezing the testicles. It was more about, I am making this vow based on my seeds, my future children. And
Right.
that was, it was making a commitment based on, I guess, your offspring. Is that the way you'd say?
Right.
But that's what it was about.
That
And
might
that just,
make
I'm
a
going,
little
my
sense.
goodness, they must have had a different perception of close contact, like personal space.
Right. Definitely personal stuff. Oh my goodness.
Something's different.
Quite different from anything I would perceive now.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, it is hard to divorce
Anyway,
the sort of sister wife story from the
sister wife.
promises and from the blessing. It is and the interesting thing is there are conversations. This is the part I've never understood about the Bible is in these stories, Isaac is still blessed. Isaac is still beloved by God. Abraham is still blessed. Abraham is still beloved by God. But then another person will do the exact same thing and God will go, well, you don't believe in the promises because you were afraid and claimed your wife was your sister. You use that stick to hit the water when I told you only to wave the stick over the water. It proves you don't listen to me or something. And you're like, wait, one day it's faithful and the next day it's not faithful to do this, right? It's a weird, I mean, they make no definition here. God does not make a comment about, making sister wives or claiming your wife as your sister to get away and be safe, but it's certainly not a faithful response. Like, hey, I think God loves me and has covenant with me to be a prosperous people. Oh, but that might die today. That doesn't seem to fit right? I mean, in that sort of who is being faithful model. Abraham and Isaac do not seem to live up to a whole lot of faith. They're pretty scared.
Well, and the sister wife thing, I mean, it's just like the one guy says, well, we could have lain with your wife thinking she was your sister and it would be okay, but it's not okay because she's married.
Right.
So they're bringing out a point that Abraham and Isaac don't seem to be concerned about.
I know.
It's like, well,
Weird.
I don't know.
It's just plain weird.
I don't know. We don't understand it.
All right. Well, we'll keep going and look at the next,
Okay.
where we continue here. So Yitzhak sowed in that land and reaped in that year 100 measures. Thus did the Lord bless him. Sometimes that's translated 100 measures, and sometimes 100-fold more than last year. Like it's sort of like an increase. Not just that he got 100 measures, but 100-fold more than would usually be out of the land, right? Like a significantly bigger harvest. And the man became great and went on becoming greater until he was exceedingly great. He had herds of sheep and herds of oxen and a large retinue of servants, and the Philistines envied. And all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father, the Philistines stopped up and filled with earth. And Abimelech said to Yitzhak, "Get away from us, for you have become exceedingly more mighty in number than we." So Yitzhak went from there. He encamped in the wadi of Gerar and settled there. Yitzhak again dug up the wells of water which had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, and the Philistines, having stopped them up after Abraham's death, and he called them by the names, the same names by which his father had called them. Yitzhak's servants also dug in the wadi and found there a well of living water. Now the shepherds of Gerar quarreled with the shepherds of Yitzhak, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, bickering, because they had bickered with him. They dug another well and quarreled also over it, so he called its name Sitnah, animosity. He moved on from there and dug another well, but they did not quarrel over it, so he called its name Rehoboth, space, and said, "Indeed, now the Lord has made space for us so that we may bear fruit in the land." And he went up from there to Beersheba. Now the Lord was seen by him on that night and said, "I am the Lord God, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will make your seed many for the sake of Abraham, my servant." He built a slaughter site there and called out the name of the Lord. He spread his tents there, and Yitzhak's servants excavated a well there. All right. So before I get into God's blessings, I meant to put a note in here. Do y'all know what a wadi is? That's one of those words that's used a lot. It's sometimes called, it's a arroyo in Spanish in the West.
Gully,
A gully. Yep.
a big
Really, it's a
gully.
little bit, so a wadi and arroyo are a little bit more specific. They look, you've seen them a million times. It is an area that when it rains, it's clearly a river, but then it dries up, right? It's a sort of seasonal river.
Mhm.
A wadi is then this sort of very low, lush area that is filled with water, usually is very green until, say, the middle of the summer, and then it dries out. And then it'll rain again in the fall or in the spring, and everything will come back and be green again, right? So it's a fertile area because all the water and dirt is all going down into that sort of alluvial valley, but it's also has a very clear connotation there, right? I mean, it's really almost a dry creek bed area. I say that because the wadi shows up again. Does anybody know where the wadi shows up again in the New Testament? It shows up several times, actually.
The Wadi Kishon.
Yep, right. There's the Wadi Kishon, right, that Jesus crosses over several times. It's right there by Jerusalem, which is that same kind of thing. I went over the Wadi Kishon this summer when we were there. It is still a sort of dry creek bed that you can tell when it rains, it becomes a nice little creek to river. Anywhere else? So it's the absurdity of the lesson that Jesus tells when he says, a wise man builds his house on rock. The foolish man builds his house on sand, or builds his house on the sand in the middle of a wadi. Right? Like, why would you build your house in a place that clearly all the rain drains? So it's not just that it's on sand, it's on the sand of a wadi in a place that very clearly always floods. Right? So when Jesus makes that juxtaposition, it's an absurdist juxtaposition. It's not just rock versus sand, it's rock versus the middle. It's like, who built his house in the middle of a dry creek bed, right? Good idea, buddy. I'm shocked that your house was knocked down later. Anyway, that's totally an aside. But anyway, so God's blessing to Isaac clearly make him very wealthy. He becomes great. Yes, very great, greater even. All those kinds of terms that are used over and over again. So we need to talk a little bit about the prosperity gospel, because these are verses that is the preachers that preach it use verses like these to claim that faith equals riches, right? And here's the hard thing. On one level, they are right. Isaac is rich thanks to his relationship with God. God makes that clear. The people all name it in the story as being why Isaac is wealthy. Isaac himself gives thanks to God for the prosperity he receives from God. Yes, on this kind of conversation, there is almost a straight line through that, because God loves Isaac and Isaac loves God, therefore he is wealthy, right? That is the blessing of prosperity comes to those who have faith in God, which is the sort of heartbeat of that prosperity gospel, right? This is why it's hard to have the argument sometimes about prosperity gospel, because it's in the text. It's not wrong, right? I mean, it's not completely accurate either, but it's, if you take it for a story here and a story there, you can find these stories. They're in the text, right? But here's the problem, the prosperity gospel, and I've been to a church, I went to a church one time like this with a friend. Sometimes they look at it as an investment process, and they literally said at the church I went to, in this one occasion, they said, they're doing the offering, and said, if you put $5 in the plate, you get $5 to church, I guarantee you'll get $500 back this week. Someone will give you $500 for something else. That is nowhere in the text. That is not in the promise. That is not how it works. It is not an investment scheme that the church guarantees you you're going, if you give $10,000, you'll be a millionaire. That's not how this works, right? I would love if that was the case. The church would be much better in stewardship season if people knew you get 100-fold return, right? But that's not exactly how it works.
It's funny, I've never thought of prosperity gospel being having any leverage in the Old Testament.
Oh, it's all over the Old Testament. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all these guys, because they have faith, they have lots of children, they have lots of money. It's right here, man. It's right at the surface for them, as they will preach it, right? As they will preach it and talk about it. But it's not always in the text. And the frustrating part of the narrative is that Isaac does nothing to deserve it, right? There's nothing that says, the prosperity gospel will say, oh, if you believe in God, he will reward you. That's not what the text says. In fact, they say, because your father and I were in good relationship, I will bless Isaac. Not because of anything Isaac does, right? His faith is almost immaterial to the promise that is continuing with him, because his dad was a great guy, according to what God says, or at least what the text says, right? Or to say it a little differently, there are lots of people in the Bible and scripture who are rich, but God simply chooses to bless them of God's free choosing. God chooses to bless Solomon with all the wealth of Sheba, right? And all this gold and all these kinds of things. Not necessarily because of something Solomon did or Isaac does or Abraham does, but because God chooses to. So it's not as a binary kind of process as the prosperity gospels will name, but it is in the text. It is undeniably in the text that God chooses to bless people. And that means not just a sort of abstract idea of God favors or loves them, but it becomes, as Brueggemann says, it becomes, in the eyes of the world, they are blessed with monetary riches, right? And animals and shepherds and all those kinds of things, right? But it's not because they're the most faithful or the pure or best at anything. right? It's not because of that. That's not what it says. It's not how the text records it. In other words, I think the text says God blessed Isaac, God chose to. If you're going to drill down into what's the theology of this text, well, God said, I'm going to bless you because I loved your father, and I blessed him because I chose to. And I chose to, really, at the end of the day, it's just God choosing to bless people, right? Almost capriciously, one could argue. It's just sort of like, I choose to bless you, but not them. And there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason that we can see to. Brueggemann tries to take it apart a little bit and says, the eyes of faith discern the reality of blessing in the language of promise. So he tries to separate blessing and promise. So the whole chapter is made into a statement about promise. But the eyes of the world discern the same reality as prosperity. Promise and prosperity are not different. However, the promise of God is the source of prosperity. He then goes on to note, though, that's how this text reads, but Job questions that connection pretty heavily if you read the book of Job, right?
Right.
Yes, God makes promises and God cares for his servants, but maybe not as much with prosperity as we want to make that connection. As humans make that connection, God does not. Or I would argue, sort of like now, we can look around and say, how on earth did that neighbor make all their money? Right? God just loves them. They're lucky. Maybe they sold a whole lot of widgets. I don't know. Right? There is a certain capriciousness to wealth as well, right? Like some people just know how to make money. Some people just are dumb lucky. It's a little bit of everything, right? But the reality is it's not like the prosperity gospel wants to talk about a direct line from God to your pocketbook, but it is in the text, right? We have to say, okay, here's God makes the promise to care for and raise up Isaac and Abraham as great people, as a great nation. So we're in that process where there is a promise and it's paying out in terms of material wealth, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything's perfect or that that's the end of the promise. In fact, it's not the end of the promise, right? The promise is to have lots of children. At this point, Isaac has no children. So the promise is still yet to actually be fulfilled. Those are my thoughts on it, but what do y'all think about Isaac and wealth, prosperity gospel, any of it?
I think it's interesting to think about Isaac, because he has such a small role, and to think about the sources for the stories, and what was, the different tribes, and those who had, come from Egypt, and those who had been there all along, and those from the north, and those from the south, and it's as if some of the stories were from one part of the the community, largely speaking, and one from another, and but it's almost like you could leave Isaac out.
Yeah, Isaac doesn't do a lot with
the Abraham stories, and there the Jacob stories, and it's like, well, really, there wasn't Isaac? It's just like, what's the literary function of Isaac? I mean, I just find it interesting to think about, as the Genesis was compiled, and they took these stories from the different writers, which some of them were more from the north and some of them were from the south, and how they put them all together, and sort of how they decided, okay, well, this is what we're going to say about Isaac.
Didn't Isaac inherit much of his wealth?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, what happened to Abraham's wealth, right? Okay. I'm assuming Isaac inherited it, but that's just me.
No, it's
Okay.
clear in the previous chapter, all that Abraham had was given to Isaac. I mean, it's very, very clear that even though he had all these other kids, he had Ishmael, he had all these other kids by their wives, Isaac got the lion's share, right?
So, I mean, the moral of the story is it's not like it ought to be a surprise, okay? But he was prosperous because he inherited it. But okay, I'm just saying. All right.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
it's that kind of, yes. I mean, I think that's completely fair to say. I think it's also fair to say it's sort of like a lot of things, right? You can be left with 4 cows and 8 sheep. And some people can lose those 4 cows and sell the sheep and not get anything hardly. And other people can take those 4 and make them into 104, right? I mean, it's of each. And it's definitely the case that Isaac built on that wealth, but he definitely, yeah, he did not start in the poorhouse by any stretch.
Hmm.
when
Sorry,
I
Nettie,
hear-
what were you gonna say?
I was just thinking, you asked what is his real role in the story, the whole, the overall story, and it seems to me like he's a bridge.
Sure.
Or that was the thought that came to my mind. That is his role, is to be a bridge between, Abraham and then going forth.
Right. I think that's fair. That's fair. Certainly a fair assessment of Isaac. He doesn't have a whole lot of other role, it doesn't seem like, other than to be the bridge to the next generation, right? You got a whole lot of excitement with Abraham and the move and the transitions and the promise, and do we live into the promise and the sacrifice or binding of Isaac, the whole 9 yards, right?
Mhm.
But Isaac 100% is this very passive figure who, even when this is his chapter, right? This is his one chapter, his one story. And even here, it's sort of like, God gave him lots of stuff and he was happy. You're like, okay, great. He got lots more and he became super wealthy and they wanted him to leave because he was too wealthy, right? I mean, it's really pretty crazy. And by the way, I've never heard of any city in the world going, hey, we want all the rich people to leave because you got too much.
Well, but does he say it's too much or there's too many of you? You see,
Those are
I
too many.
understood that there was too many of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's in there. I think you're right.
It's not that they were too wealthy, there just ended up being too many of them. Okay. So, because I'm assuming prosperity also meant lots of kids too. Maybe not Isaac's kids, but I mean all his entourage. Okay. So,
Right. All the families and shepherds and
and,
water bearers and whatever else, camel herders. Yes.
and servants. And yeah, you got it. Yeah. 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 Okay.
And slaves. Yes. I mean, if his dad had slaves, did the slaves get passed on to him? All that kind of stuff.
But also, weren't they using up all the resources? I mean, as they grew, they were using up all of the
It could be. Yeah.
resources, like land, water.
Yeah.
Which kind of is indicated, when they're digging up, redigging up the wells. Okay, so yeah, they start having fights. Okay, because they got so they just kept
Absolutely.
on moving.
Yep. They keep moving. They keep pushing. And yeah, and you have the whole well kind of thing, which is an interesting one unto itself, right? There's water and lots of questions there.
Which I'm
What's
assuming back then probably true wealth, right? I mean, without water, it's going to be very hard to feed your flock.
Absolutely.
Okay,
No, I think these are literal wells dug in the ground for literal water. I don't think there's any figurativeness to, like, sometimes people are speaking figuratively, right? Like I'm still not sure when it says that they were laughing and together and he's like, oh, you must be married. I'm like, I think that might be another euphemism for sex on some level.
Mhm.
Right? That there's something else that's going on that they realized, wait a second. But yeah, in this case, I think a well is a well, water is water, living water is living water, which typically in the Old Testament, that means water that is good to drink or really good water, right? I mean, it is most of the time in ancient sources, when they talk about living water, it is moving water, right? Like a stagnant water can have all kinds of stuff in it. But if it's a creek that's moving, that's usually better for you to drink out of than just a stale water oasis of pond kind of thing. All right. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. We'll keep going because the story continues. But here's the other part. Some, including Brigham Young, point to Isaac as a man of peace, for whom all God's blessings operate. right? So they'll sort of almost point to, because he's peaceful and just sort of moves, instead of fighting all these times where they fill in the wells, or they claim, basically his people dig the well, but they claim it's theirs, even though they had nothing to do with it. He moves on. And so Brueggemann sort of points to this Isaac as a man who, well, all God's blessings operate for peace, right? A man of peace, or a person who is peaceful. I certainly agree that Isaac chooses to be a man of peace. He could fight at each of those wells and say, no, we dug them up, it's ours. His decision to hand them over or let people take them and not get into a conflict is an interesting one, but it shows he's also not one willing to get particularly in depth with a local battle. But I don't know that the text, or his life for that matter, reflect that a peacemaker, or my life rather, reflect that a peacemaker always receives blessings from God either, right? I get the connection. I know we value peacemakers, but I don't know if I agree with Brueggemann's sort of take that, well, this man of peace, for whom all of God's blessings operate. Maybe. It's certainly true for Isaac. Isaac gets that benefit. But again, I think that's more because God chooses to love Isaac and Abraham, not because of Isaac's choice to not be in conflict with his neighbor. I don't know. What do y'all think about that side of it? That was another Brueggemann thought for this section.
I just have trouble with all this, Bill, simply because God created all man, and so why is he loving Abraham and Isaac more than anybody else? I struggle with this, Bill. So,
well, I mean, to pull the lens back, I agree. I mean, I think this is the fundamental thing about a decent percentage of anti-Semitism. A lot of anti-Semitism is just stupidity and rumors and not knowing our fellow human beings, right? But I do think that there's a percentage of anti-Semitism that comes about because they say, well, we're the beloved of God, right? And there's good old-fashioned jealousy within that, right or wrong. That you go, why are they beloved by God, right? Why do they have a vaunted place above everyone else? What does that mean? How do we engage that, right? And yeah, that's the hard part of a good percentage of the Old Testament, is if God made everybody, why has he chosen Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be the perfect family or start the perfect community of people, right? I mean, it's a weird, and it certainly demonstrates that God can choose what God chooses, but it also, why should we be surprised that it creates discord and disagreement and envy and all kinds of other problems, right? And then why does God do it? Like, well, God, why are you doing this? This seems to like create a difficult situation to have the favorite child amongst many.
well, I think the problem in here, particularly in the early Old Testament, okay, is that I think they're much humanist to God, if that makes sense. Okay, they make God act like a human being rather than like God, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Mom likes me better than she likes you. Ha ha ha. Okay,
Oh,
I
exactly.
just have trouble with that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the things they didn't understand were ascribed to the will of God. And so they look at it and say, this person has great material wealth. Obviously, God has favored this one.
Right.
And it's like, well, we don't know why God necessarily did, but we can see from the material wealth that God must have. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, and that certainly, I mean, underlines underlines a lot of the approach that the Deuteronomists took when they edited the scripture, and that the kings who were successful were the ones who were doing God's will, and when the kings had problems, it's because they had weren't doing God's will. God was, was showing disfavor upon them, and that continues really all the way up to the time. People are asking Jesus about that. Who sinned that this man was born blind?
Right. I'd say it continues to the current day. People still use some of that language, right? They'll go like, oh, well, sometimes they'll say that person was unlucky, or that president was unlucky, or that leader was unlucky. And sometimes it's, well, they let that happen. They didn't do the right thing. They were not in the right place. It was a sinful nation. It was a broken nation, all those kinds of things, right? We have put a lot of meaning on all those issues we can't otherwise explain still.
Yeah, I mean, I heard this quote on the radio today saying, "Well, my 401k is down, 25%. It's got to be the fault of the party in power." That's the only answer. Okay.
Exactly.
Yep.
Bill, you're scheming something.
No, I'm not really. I'm just
While you're
thinking of other ways.
scheming, may I ask a question?
Sure.
On the last bullet point, I know we value them, and I think you're saying we value men of peace.
Yeah.
And I know that we do value men of peace, like Gandhi, Martin Luther. But on the other hand, do we just as often honor the winners of a battle? The admiral, the general, or whatever, or like the Genghis Khan, they were honored, but
Sure.
they were not men of peace. So when I was reading that, it just made me wonder.
Oh, yeah. Well, we value them when they're successful the way we want to be successful, right?
Oh, that's the other part. These guys, the
Chamberlain is not particularly well thought of, right? He gave away half of Czechoslovakia and is looked horribly upon for appeasement, right? And the worst thing you can possibly do is to pull a Chamberlain, right? Even though, God bless him, he was just trying to keep people from getting killed. And on one level, on that pure like man of peace, yeah, he was a man of peace. He was trying to preserve the peace and not get all of Europe in a big war. But yeah, then we tend to value Eisenhower and Roosevelt a lot more than him, right?
That's what I was gonna
People-
say, yeah.
Or go down the long list of people that we value more because they beat the bad guys or the things that we didn't want to happen.
Yeah.
And even then, you list Gandhi and King, both were killed, right? Both were assassinated. So we value them to a certain degree, but man, they can be really annoying. Those people call us to a higher action, and I don't really want to listen to them anymore.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's all these are layers on top of layers, which makes it hard. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, Stefan, you're absolutely right. Like, this is the hard part of the text. It's not, you can take it at face value and just go, well, God chose to love Isaac. Well, okay, great. God chose to love Jacob. Great. But if you're paying attention to the story, there's a lot of shadow to it, right? There's a lot of, well, what about Ishmael? What about Esau? What about the brothers from the other families, right? There's 3 or 4 wives. What does any of this mean? How does this play out? Did God not love them too? Or did not favor them? Or is it just because this is the point of our story? Like it begs a lot more questions than it answers, to say the least.
Well, I mean, I think the most troublesome thing is we see these guys are regularly engaging in deception, tricks, fraud, and ultimately are honored for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are people who are celebrated for being pretty awful folk. Jacob is not a great guy.
Mhm.
Or, I mean, on the other side, Isaac is given, he gives God lots of credit for all of these wonderful things that happened. But you know what? If he got a wadi in the desert, that is the low point where all of the water is and where the nicest land is, well, that's going to be the best place to plant anyway. It's not necessarily that God blessed you. You're in the right place with the best land and the best crops, right? Like, I mean, God did not to bless him, but that's sort of hard to mess up. If he had been in the desert and suddenly God caused a spring to bubble up from the ground and watered all of the ground, that's a different thing. But in this case, it sure seems like, well, he found a really rich piece of earth and a good spot to put all his sheep and did pretty well with them. Well, no surprise there. That's not necessarily God. He just had a good knack for picking the right place to be.
But that's a question. Was
It is
that
a
free land? Was that land he was taking? I mean,
Yeah.
who owned the land?
Yep.
Or did he just go in and say, this is my land, I'm claiming it? You know?
Who knows? Who knows? He just keeps moving until no one bugs him. So guess this is the land where no one bugged him. They decided it was far enough out of town.
I guess.
Who knows? All right, so we'll look at the last part of the chapter here. Now, Abimelech went to him from Gerar, along with Ahuzat, his aide, and Pichol, the commander of his army. And Yitzhak said to them, why have you come to me? For you hate me and have sent me away from you. They said, we have seen that the Lord has been with you. So we say, pray, let there be an oath curse between us and you. We want to cut a covenant with you. If ever you should deal badly with us, just as we have not harmed you, and just as we have only dealt well with you and have sent you away in peace, you are now blessed by the Lord. So this is the way the Hebrew reads. Usually gets translated a little bit more clearly to say, if you should ever deal badly with us, that would be bad, just as we have not harmed you. It's basically saying, let's form a covenant where we take care of each other, right? And we don't hurt each other. So he made them a drinking feast, and they ate and drank. And early in the morning, they swore an oath to one another. Then Yitzhak sent them off, and they went from him in peace. Peace is definitely repeated a lot, right? If nothing else, shalom here all over the place. Now it was on that same day that the Lord's servants came and told him about the well that they had been digging. And they said to him, we have found water. So he called it Shiva, swearing 7. Therefore, the name of the city is Beer-sheva until this day. When Esau was 40 years old, he took to wife Yehudit, daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and Basemat, daughter of Elon, the Hittite. And there was a bitterness of spirit to Yitzhak and Rivka. So we'll start with the last 2 lines. I'm not a relationship expert, but I'm pretty sure I know why Isaac and Rebecca didn't get along after his 2 side marriages. Just a guess, probably because, I don't know, he got married twice more. I think it's a solid guess, right? But interestingly, we don't hear anything about those children. This is another sort of thing to Stefan's point, right? Like he takes 2 additional wives, but they just sort of disappear. And I'm sure he had children by them, but Esau is even more valued than whoever these other children might be, right? The cousins, the extras of those spares, whatever you want to call them, are just not even there. They're just happen to be another part of the story, but not really an important part of the story. For Brueggemann, this chapter as a whole marks a movement from famine to living water, which I had not really paid attention to, but it does. It starts, right? There was a famine in the land and he wants to leave. And he says, you can't go down to, do not go to Egypt. So he stays, but then somehow it literally goes from famine to completely prospering. There's living water, there's abundance galore. It's not much of a famine if it's a famine, right? He goes from roaming to a lasting place. That's literally the name of the place that he names, right? The well. Here's my lasting place. This is plenty of living room for me. Or from promise to abundant blessing, right? There's the promise that God will care for him, but then there's this abundance of everything, which is interesting. But sort of to Stefan's question, I agree. I also wonder about the clear hyperbole of it. That is, they claim that Isaac has more wealth than all the Philistines, or at least more people than all the Philistines, that he's crowding them out, right? Which is an interesting. First, we have to name it's probably anachronistic to even talk about the Philistines. They're likely about 200 or 300 years away in the future. They're not even a nation at this point. But it's also doubtful that one person has more than a nation or even a city-state, right? So it's this. Why is the hyperbole there? Why is Isaac getting built up so much in this chapter, right? As both a peacemaker, but also just a wealthy land baron, something. Not land baron's not even the right term, right? But he's just a wealthy man with abundance of oxen and sheep and goats and cattle and everything, and slaves and wives and you name it, right? He's got it all. I agree on one level, it's about God's unmerited blessing on Isaac and the covenant, because the text makes that connection. But I guess sort of like to Stefan's question, why? Why has God chosen to bless Isaac? Why are we learning this story now? Why is this so important to have, right? For me, I can only say it's really to set the stakes for the blessing controversy that is to come, right? So the next chapter we get into, Isaac is going to bless his sons, Jacob and Esau, and there's a battle for who gets that blessing. Well, if it's just Isaac's blessing and we don't have this chapter, who cares, right? What does it mean to get Isaac's blessing if Isaac doesn't really have any money or any power or any authority? He's just the son of Abraham, right? Like on one level, okay, great, you get the promise through Abraham, but Isaac is truly an intermediary. I wonder if this is meant just to build Isaac up to a certain degree as a person of peace, as a person of wealth and fame and local authority, right? So that it matters between Jacob and Esau that their father blesses them. That's my answer anyway. That was Brueggemann did not say that. And neither did Friedman, who I read the other, not Friedman, but I can't think of his name. Anyway, the two commentaries I read, neither mentioned anything about that, but I just wonder if that's part of this telling the story. Like if you're telling a narrative and you were just to go from, and then they had Isaac and Rebecca had Jacob and Esau, and then went to this, and then went straight into the argument about the blessing. I don't know that it makes as much sense, but it makes sense if you're telling the whole narrative to have a little bit of story about why Isaac mattered, why his blessing matters, why they have to fight about who gets the birthright and the money and the stuff.
Right. The whole thing boils down to the money and the property, and
Yeah, I think that's at least part of it.
to me, it seems like it boils down to that. If you're the one that gets the blessing, then you get all the good stuff too that goes with it.
Yeah.
So it's not just a loving blessing. It's, to me, it isn't he the one that gets everything?
Yeah,
One
Jacob
that gets
becomes
the blessing.
Yeah, to look ahead to next week.
We have to wait till next week to find out.
Yeah, we do. We're out of time this week. So next week's chapter 27, Jacob steals the blessing and then flees the righteous anger of his brother, right?
Uh-huh.
But other thoughts about I don't know, chapter 26, which again, this is the only really Isaac story we get. So it's a fascinating one, but what do we do with it? I guess is my real question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about the blessing and how it figures in. I mean, one perspective is that the foundational story is the Exodus and the salvation narrative, and that the Genesis. Then Genesis is written to sort of flesh out the story. Not to say that the stories didn't exist, but it's written from the perspective of people who know the Exodus story, and it's almost as if it's like this the creation of the good old days.
Yeah.
So we're longing for the time of peace, prosperity, happiness, and so it's one thing if we never had that. You know,
Right, right.
You know, if we've been scuffling along for 1,000 years, you know, with a you know, but to say, oh, there were, you know, this had a grand beginning, and there was a great relationship here, and we need to get back to that in all respects.
Yeah, could be certainly. Yeah, why is it worthwhile for Jacob to be so deceiving, right? To go to sort of at any costs betray his brother and his family and everybody else to make sure he gets the good old days and all this stuff, right? All these battles that you have to fight, literally wrestle with God at one point even for, right?
Because he's
Yeah.
a heel.
I can't relate to Jacob. I can't figure him out.
No. Yeah,
He's a heel, Lynn. And it's easy. Yeah.
He's not just the heel grabber, he's the heel. Yeah.
He's the heel.
Heel.
I just go ahead. He's the heel.
Yeah, he's not an easy cat to love or love on at any point. The only time I can have any sympathy is when he basically thinks his son is killed and, you know, he's mourning Joseph. But otherwise, everything until then, it's really hard to sympathize with Jacob at all. Even when he gets tricked, you're like, well, you sort of deserve it, buddy.
Yeah. Interesting.
Other thoughts on Isaac? Next week we'll look at Jacob. We'll jump into that side of it.
Yeah, this is it for Isaac. Isaac's now gone, right?
Isaac's pretty much gone. I mean, he will show up for the next
Except-
one, but just to give the
God.
blessing. Yeah, he's
That's
pretty
it.
much gone after this.
I mean,
His
he's
story
really
is
just
quick.
like a literary character for the transition from the Abraham stories to the Jacob stories.
Mhm.
All right. Well, if we got nothing else, good to be with you today, my friends.
Okay.
And
All right.
you
We will
Enjoy it.
see you next
Good
week.
everybody.
See you Sunday.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sunday. Goodbye.